Welcome, everyone, to our Burlington Public Library live event. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Burlington Public Library is located on the ancestral and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples, and we would like to express our gratitude as they continue to share their ancestral lands with us.
This afternoon's session is being offered in partnership with a Different Drummer bookstore. Ian Elliott has worked in the independent bookstore business for over 30 years. Beginning his career at the shop he has owned since 2010, Burlington's beloved A Different Drummer bookstore. He is also a recipient of the Key to the City. Ian will share his insight on marketing and attraction to build loyal customers. We're very pleased this afternoon to host this event in partnership, so please join me in welcoming Ian Elliott.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for the very kind words. It's my great honor to introduce today's guest in a discussion about marketing. There's absolutely no way to do better, and he's an absolutely wonderful man as well. His name's Terry O'Reilly. He is a native of Sudbury. Many great people seem to come from Sudbury, I've noticed lately. Terry began his towering career as copy chief for Burlington's own FM 108 radio, and his succeeding work with leading Toronto-based marketing firms, which involved incisive, inspired, and effective campaigns for Goodyear, Tim Hortons, the Hudson's Bay Company, and many others, quickly made him a doyen of the advertising trade. Terry founded Pirate Radio and Television in 1990, and he created groundbreaking commercials, and he earned international award recognition. He has received honors here and overseas on over 300 occasions. No exaggeration, 300 and counting. June of 2005 marked the first broadcast on CBC Radio of O'Reilly on advertising, succeeded by The Age of Persuasion and now Under the Influence. These have entertained and edified listeners all over the continent and further with their fascinating analysis of the mechanisms and the psychology of promotion and the participation of the consumer in that process. And they're always presented lucidly, insightfully, and with so much wit by Terry O'Reilly. And Terry has also shared his great experience and his revelations in his writing. His first book was authored with his broadcasting colleague, Mike Tennant, entitled The Age of Persuasion, How Marketing Ate Our Culture. This was an enormous success, and it's an entrepreneur's touchstone. And this, I know, succeeding that book, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence, blends his own story and his great humor with the mechanisms he brilliantly identifies in his trade as enacted in his time and historically as well. It's a work of great wide-ranging social history and psychological observation. And this season, we have just enjoyed the release of My Best Mistake, Epic Fails and Silver Linings. It's a wonderfully instructive collection of business, innovation, and personal endeavors, and the turns they take. It will fascinate you, indeed blow your mind. It certainly did that for me, and Terry O'Reilly has done this for decades. So it's with great honor and great gratitude that we welcome Terry O'Reilly.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Hi, Terry. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah,
my absolute pleasure.
The first thing I'd like to ask, I relished the book so much when I read it. The only thing I can imagine adding to the experience would be to hear it all in your in that famous speaking voice of yours. So I would ask, could you read the entire book to us now?
I'll get right on it.
It's evident from your books, from everything you've published and all the time you've been on the air that you seem to have been everywhere and researched the history of seemingly every business enterprise out there. At what point in your own career or in your investigations did you realize that mistakes, misadventures, minor and catastrophic, these often are a wellspring of success? Is it something you identified ages ago, or something that you gradually took notice of over the years?
Well, I definitely have an insatiable curiosity for the way brands bounce back from debacles and tragedy, and I've always been fascinated by creative solutions to really big problems. And if you've listened to our radio show or podcast, you know that that's a big part of our content. So I've always been fascinated by how to bounce back.
Right. Yeah. Well, I noticed at one point in my best mistake, you cite Malcolm Gladwell. He posits that all entrepreneurs, and this actually might be a little counterintuitive for the most of us. He suggests that all entrepreneurs believe they are onto a sure thing, as opposed to our conventional wisdom that entrepreneurs tolerate risk in an unusual way.
Right.
So, with all due respect to Mr. Gladwell, I dare say you've had more experience than anyone I can think of with entrepreneurs, business visions, business plans, and I mean your own extraordinary career bespeaks that itself. My limited experience tells me that anxiety, no matter what you think you have, is always high. So, what is your opinion about the sure thing?
Well, I thought that was a very interesting insight because I felt the same thing. So I have this theory that entrepreneurs get to a stage in their career before they start their own companies that they get really frustrated. Mm-hmm. And then they have a fist banging moment on the table and say, there's got to be a better way. And then they eventually discover the better way, or they create the better way. When I started my company in 1989 called Pirate Radio, that was my moment too, where I would, in advertising agency life, a script is written and then it has to go to a production company, and then you hire a director to direct the radio or direct the television. Mm-hmm. When I was an ad writer, I would do that, and I worked with directors in Toronto and Vancouver and New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. And I always found myself fighting to save my work from the director. In other words, instead of the director making it better and beautiful, they would always want to change it or turn it inside out. And it just frustrated me. I was constantly frustrated. So I created the company I could not find, which was a company that directed commercials and protected the idea, directed them from a writer's point of view. So I was sure I was onto a big thing when I started, even though I was leaving behind a high-paying job. My wife was pregnant with our first daughter. We had just bought our first home. And I said to her one day, I want to start my own company. And even when you think that may have been the worst time or the most perilous time to start a company, when you're just starting out, being married and having a baby and having a mortgage. But I was so sure I was onto a sure thing, because I knew other writers felt the same way as me. So I completely agree with Malcolm.
Right. Well, I'll try not to sort of keep coming back to the idea of anxiety, but there is a fair bit of what I would describe as terror in your book. I'm thinking specifically of the Mario Puzo chapter, but I'm wondering, do you feel that we should always be able to find the kernel of truth or wisdom when we fail in an endeavor? Should we immediately shift gears to the philosophical and extract that? Or, I mean, when endeavors either fail or not necessarily fail, but take us to the wrong place, does it take unusual circumstances for the nugget of wisdom to show itself, the perspective of an outsider, or is it just time? Or
well, that's a good question, because all the stories in my book all center on that moment where all these people made horrific mistakes, made sometimes catastrophic career mistakes, but they all worked through the pain of it, because there's a lot of pain in the middle of a mistake. But they also they didn't run away from it. They kind of stuck with it. And by doing that, by sticking with the mistake and owning it and working their way through it, they all found an incredible opportunity in sitting in the heart of the mistake, at the center of the mistake. So I think it may take a certain kind of individual, excuse me, to stick out a mistake, like to really, see it through. But I think the big learning was that if you can work your way through a horrific mistake, that there will be an opportunity waiting on the other side of it. Instead of running away from it, if you see it through, you may find a hidden gift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thank you. I was going to say it's certainly one thing, and certainly very painful to have business and career disappointments and reversals. It's quite something else, and it's something you deal with in great detail in the book, to have a very public fail.
Yeah.
Something devastating happened to you publicly. And one that, if you're a leader or a media figure, and your credibility it suffers severe damage.
Yeah.
This happens to Brian Williams, most strikingly in the book. But he rebounded. And I'm just wondering, can you talk about maybe Mr. Williams, how he found his way back to grace, and if that's always possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it always possible? And he failed publicly in a huge way. So for those who may not know the story, Brian Williams was a longtime anchorman for the NBC News, which is really the pinnacle of the NBC organization, because almost everything emanates from the credibility of your main news anchor in networks, and then world networks. So Brian was covering a war in overseas. He was in a helicopter one day. The helicopter in front of them, in another helicopter, took some ground fire. They all had to land to get out of the way of the artillery. He then would tell that story in different places later, and he would tell it accurately. And then over the years, the story started to change. And as he told it, it suddenly became he said that his helicopter took the artillery, which was not the fact. So when he was called out on that by the other military men that were in his helicopter and the one that took the ground fire, he was suspended. He lost his job, because what does an anchorman have? What is the biggest asset an anchorman has? But it's their credibility. And because he had changed the story, he had lost all his credibility. So he was suspended from NBC. They didn't fire him. They suspended him. They replaced him. He basically lost his job, but he wasn't, let go. So what happened with him was he was suspended without pay for a long time. Then someone at NBC wanted to start a new late night television show that looked at political news at 11 p.m. because suddenly in the Trump era, a lot of news was coming out late at night. So they wanted to start a program that aired at 11 p.m. that caught all the news that was, in the Trump era, they would release a lot of news late at night because they were hoping that the press wouldn't pick it up. But so Brian Williams threw his hat in the ring and said, can I try and make a comeback with this show? So it was late at night. It was kind of like, what would I call it? Almost like purgatory for him. Like, it wasn't the glamour spot. It wasn't the primetime, network show. But he started doing this show, which was only supposed to run for a small amount of time. But here's the thing. Brian Williams, what I discovered in my research was he really wanted to be a talk show host. When Letterman vacated his spot on one network, and when Leno vacated his spot on another network, he actually applied for those jobs. Oh. And the network chairman all said no, because they couldn't imagine an anchorman suddenly doing late night chit chat about movies. So in his heart, he always wanted to be a talk show guy because he's funny, he's quick, he's smart, he enjoys it. So when he got the 11th hour on MSNBC, a sister station of NBC, he really landed, it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to him, because he got a talk show and he got to display his humor, which he could never really display as an anchor man. And he wasn't just, glued to a teleprompter. He could have a conversation with people. So, and it was the Trump era. So there was no better material and content than Trump and everything that was going on in Washington. So he actually, through incredible pain and loss of dignity and credibility, bounced back, and I think landed in the best job he's ever had. Now, he just announced he's leaving, but I'm going to stick to my hypothesis that whatever he's going to do next will even be a further extension of being a talk show host. So wait and see.
Yeah, one thing I found interesting about Mr. Williams' story is something you quite sagely observed about the program itself, is that it's analytical rather than confrontational.
Right. Yeah, so there was no, it wasn't like a caged fight. It wasn't like a caged unification match like what happens on CNN. This was really more thoughtful and analytical, and there was like really interesting conversations going on. So it suited him right down to the ground.
Yeah. I wondered if Steven Spielberg's story resonated with you personally as a film, as you've worked extensively in film, and you've probably had a lot of on-set issues.
Yeah.
Can you maybe perhaps talk a little about Mr. Spielberg's misadventure and trying to get Jaws off the ground?
That's such a great story, and it's indicative of my whole book, which is why it's the first chapter in the book. So Steven Spielberg was 28 years old when he landed Jaws. So that was a huge opportunity for him, his first big shot at directing a full-length motion picture. So because he was young and because he had lots of bravado and not a lot of experience, he wanted to shoot in the ocean, and he wanted to use a full-size animatronic shark. So most other directors probably would have used miniature sharks in a big tank in Hollywood and then made it look like the ocean. But Spielberg wanted full-size shark in the ocean. So he had 3 animatronic sharks built. So one would move left to right, one would move right to left, and then one was fully skinned for the full-on shots. It cost a huge percentage of his overall budget to build it. So they went out to Martha's Vineyard to shoot the film because the water there, the ocean around Martha's Vineyard was shallow. So even, 5-6 miles out, it still was only 30 feet deep, which was perfect for filming. But when he put the animatronic sharks in the ocean, they started to malfunction immediately. The animatronics started to seize up. The pneumatic hoses started to spring leaks. The 3 sharks sank to the bottom immediately. And that's when they realized their huge mistake. And the mistake Steven Spielberg made was he didn't test them out in salt water. He had only tested them in freshwater tanks in Hollywood. The salt corroded the mechanics. So here he was on location in Martha's Vineyard with all his crew, all his cast, 3 sharks that aren't working. And he's sitting in his hotel room at one night panicking because it was his first shot at a big movie and nothing was working. So he got to some point in the middle of the night as he sat in the dark, and he asked himself a very interesting question. He asked himself, what would Hitchcock do? And when he recalibrated his thinking to think like Hitchcock, it came to him that what we can't see is the most terrifying thing of all. So he rewrote the whole script so we didn't see the shark. In other words, he implied the shark. So we would see a dorsal fin and a tail moving through the water. You wouldn't see what's in the middle. And that would give you a sense of how big the shark was. Or that scene, Ian, where they attach the yellow barrels to the shark and you see the shark just pulling those barrels through the water and you realize how powerful the shark is. And then, of course, John Williams' amazing music score, one of the greatest scores of all time, that would intensify as the shark got closer to the scene, and then it would actually start to minimize as the shark swam away. So all of that made us feel like we've seen the shark through the whole movie. But the reality was we only saw the full shark for 4 minutes in that entire film. So what was a huge mistake on Spielberg's behalf of not testing it out in saltwater ended up being the best thing that ever happened to him, because not seeing the shark was the magic of that film. And Spielberg said that the fact the shark did not work added $175 million to the box office take.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that he was an extraordinary man, even at 28 years old, who could think on his feet in that way with all that pressure bearing down on him.
Oh, you can't even imagine the pressure he was under. You can't imagine it.
Yeah, and I was reluctant to give this away, but I can't help myself. I was amused to read that he wasn't really all that impressed with Mr. Williams' 2-note theme. At
That's right. When John Williams first played Steven Spielberg the amazing Jaws theme, Spielberg laughed out loud and said to him, "You can't be serious." If you can imagine that. But John Williams talked him into it, and wow, was he right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was interesting to me that you vary the length of the narratives in the book. I mean, we get a few pages on the origin of the popsicle.
Yeah.
And the origin of cornflakes.
Yeah.
And there's a long, deeply involving, intricate narrative about Steve Jobs yeah. Can you suggest what it was? I mean, maybe some stories find their way immediately to the point, and some don't. Or
yeah, my criterion for stories was that someone had to make a mistake, an intentional mistake, rather than an accident. Because a lot of brands I've talked about on my show were invented by accidents. For example, someone was working on radar for the military in World War II, and every time he went near the radar machine, he had a chocolate bar in his pocket, and his chocolate bar would melt every time he went near the machine. And he thought, well, why does that keep happening? And of course, that led to the invention of the radar range, which of course was the microwave oven. That story didn't make my book because it was an accident. I was looking for mistakes. So some stories were very short, like the popsicle. He made the mistake of leaving a drink with a stir stick on his porch overnight. When he went out in the morning, he realized he'd forgotten to take it in. He went to pull the stick out and he couldn't get the stick out because it was frozen. So he ran it under hot water and then pulled the whole thing out on a stick and then started licking it and thinking, this might be something, this might even be a product.
So at a very tender age, he became one of the world's great innovators.
Well, that's right. When his name was Frank Epperson, and when he licked this drink on a stick and thought this could be something interesting, he was 11 years old, if you can imagine that. Mm-hmm. And then later, when in his 20s, he ended up revisiting it and becoming a huge, successful entrepreneur. Another short story in the book, really short, is about Seth MacFarlane. Because as you know, he is an industry unto himself in Hollywood with Family Guy and the movies he creates, and he records record albums. He has a $200 million deal in Hollywood. Like he is an industry for animation in Hollywood. And none of that would have happened if he had not made a mistake in 2001, where he was flying back to Rhode Island from Los Angeles because he was giving a speech at his alma mater, the school he went to. That night, he went out drinking with the teachers and some students and got incredibly drunk. The next morning, he was hungover, and he was to go to Boston to get the plane back to LA, and he overslept because he was drunk. He then raced to the airport, didn't get there in time for his flight, and then decided to take a later flight. So he went to sleep it off in the lounge, and he heard all this activity 45 minutes later and looked up at the television set. And the flight he was supposed to be booked on was the first flight that hit the Twin Tower. So that's an amazing story, but a short one. Whereas Steve Jobs, I wanted to tell the story that how invested Steve Jobs was in Apple. And the mistake he made was hiring John Scully to be president, wooed him away from Pepsi. And John Scully would end up firing Steve Jobs from the very company that he founded. So I wanted to tell that story in a lot more detail so you know how absolutely devastating and crushing that was for Steve Jobs when he spent so much time wooing John Scully and he didn't know he was wooing the man that would fire him.
Thank you, Terry. As I mentioned, it's such a generous book. There's so much social history, personal history. It just envelops you while you're reading it. I began to wonder, was it difficult to limit the book to 24 narratives the way you did?
It was. I had a longer list of stories, but it was really more a feel thing, Ian. I think when I had written the 24th chapter, I thought that's the book that I'd covered, because there's a lot of different stories in there. I covered directors, actors, writers, athletes, inventors. Like I wanted to cover a whole spectrum of human endeavor in that book. And I felt by that point at the 24th chapter that I'd covered what I wanted to cover.
And I also wanted to talk, I know Michelle was curious about this as well. The way you tell a story is incisive, to the point, but with great attention to detail. The detail is just riveting. And to me, that speaks a lot of rigorous, deep research and editing. Can you share a little with us about the research process? And
research is a big part of our radio show too.
Yeah.
What's interesting about our radio show is the coming up with the themes, the episode themes, is the easiest part of the show. Many people ask me if that's the toughest part of the show, but it isn't. It's the easiest part of the show because so much is happening in the world of marketing around the world at any given time. The research is the toughest part of our radio show because depending on the episode theme, we probably do between 20 and 30 hours and sometimes more hours of research for a 27-minute show. So throughout, I'm starting my 17th season on CBC in January. Over the past 16 years, we really learned how to research. And we have a team of researchers that are incredible. So the research process was very similar to what we applied to our radio program, which is I would make very detailed notes on the story I was after, the beats of the story I was looking for, what I wanted to uncover in it, and then I would dispatch our researchers to find very specific things. And they know how to deep research because this was a book. My last book was about marketing, and I could just write that off the top of my head. Just here's my philosophy on marketing. This book, I had to research every sentence. Every sentence was a result of research. So that's how deep we had to go with the research on this book.
Yeah. And it raises another question I'm kind of interested in. Well, hearing you on the radio and reading your books, you work in all media, and I'm just wondering: do you work instinctively? Did you have a lot? Were you mentored? Did you have a lot of training, or was it just something? So you took the football and ran with it, so to speak, or?
You mean in media in general?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, my advertising background definitely gave me a lot of learning in all mediums because in advertising, you're working in all mediums, radio, television, print, outdoor billboards, newspaper, we did it all. So I was writing for print because there's a lot of print required in advertising, doing a lot of broadcasts, which is a very different beast. Television is very different from radio. Outdoor billboards, 7 words or less, is very different than having a double page spread in a magazine where you get to really tell your story. So I think my advertising background really, really gave me the best grounding in all the mediums. And then of course, social media, which has changed everything, is a whole other set of channels at our disposal. And I think all of us are still learning on how to use them because Twitter is very different from Instagram very different from Facebook very different from LinkedIn. That's a whole world too. So,
Well, yeah, I meant what I said when I introduced you to her. I'm just astounded at how well you do it all. It's I think, and I don't know how it's possible, but you are a marvel.
Well,
sir.
Thank you, Ian. I try. That's all I can say.
I was going to ask Michelle. Perhaps did you want to bring up a question or two?
Thank you, Ian. Yes, for sure. I was enjoying listening in the background here. So one of the things that has been discussed a lot. So as part of the Literary Festival, we've had a number of conversations around story development and story arc. And I think a lot of people think that nonfiction books maybe don't have that similar development piece. But when I was reading your short stories, there's absolutely story arcs and developments. Can you maybe expand on that a bit?
I definitely believe in story arcs. I mean, everything we do on the radio show, for example, so the interior architecture of our radio show, which you may or may not know from listening to it from the outside, is I tell 6 stories. I have an opening story that sets the table on the radio show, which is usually not marketing related, but I'm setting the table. I'm getting you into my slipstream for what the show will be about. And then I tell 5 stories that are linked to that theme. And because it's nonfiction, my radio show, as is the book, I still think a great story is a great story. It has to have an arc. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it has to have some tension, and then some release, and then some tension. And I think that all of that applies to nonfiction. All those tools that fiction writers use. I mean, even in this book, I have to make you feel Steve Jobs' personality, or who would be another great example of what Armand Bombardier was, what kind of a man he was before he invented the snowmobile, because it was born of tragedy, because he was living in a rural part of Quebec. And in the wintertime, everybody in that town was marooned and stranded because they couldn't leave the town because of the amount of snow. And one day his young son got very ill, and they couldn't get him to the hospital, even though the hospital was less than 10 miles away, because they were stranded in their city. And that devastation led him to create the snowmobile. So I needed you to feel the emotion in that story, not just the facts of that story. So I really do believe that nonfiction storytelling is storytelling.
Oh, definitely. It was definitely gripping to read each of these stories. And they were absolutely so in-depth and fascinating. And I was very struck by the last story in the book, the story on the development of the medical checklist. I was very curious how this particular story came to your attention.
I had read a book that Atul Gawande had written called the Checklist Manifesto, which was really the story of him pursuing this checklist for surgeons. So as he says in his book, and I said in my chapter, that more people in the United States in particular were dying of surgical complications than were dying in car accidents in the US. And I think it was 3 times the amount of people were dying as a result of surgical complications. So Atul Gawande wondered if he could borrow a leaf from another industry that had figured out a way to solve a lot of mistakes. And he looked to the airline industry. So the airline industry has a series of checklists. So there's a checklist pilots go through before they take off in the air. Then there's another checklist when something goes wrong in the air. So when a pilot suddenly is faced mid-air, mid-flight, with a severe mechanical problem, there's a checklist that is there for him or her to go through. And Atul Gawande wondered if he could do the same thing for surgeons. Could there be a checklist in the operating room that would ensure that they just followed an orderly thing that would probably eliminate a lot of the problems? So he did do that. He's fashioned this amazing checklist for surgeons based on pilots' checklists. And the results of that was extraordinary. I mean, the number of surgical complications dropped to almost 0 in some hospitals. From the deaths were like extraordinary to like 0. So that was one of the greatest, born of mistakes, one of the greatest solutions to one of the gravest series of mistakes. And this is just not in the US, around the world adapted his checklist.
So your initial thought for that actually came from reading a book.
Came from reading. Yeah, I read, and I never forgot his book. Loved it.
That's fantastic. We are getting some questions in the Q&A, Terry. So I have one more that I'm going to ask you, and then it looks like we'll have some time for the Q&A questions. And then I'll have a final question for you at the end.
Okay.
So I am curious, because book covers are such an important marketing tool for a book. Can you tell us how the cover of this book was decided?
Okay, I love the cover of my book. I love it. So I said to HarperCollins, when my editor, Brad Wilson, and I started talking about what the cover might be, and I said to Brad, he said, what's your thinking on it? I said, I want an idea, not a design. So he said, okay, got it. So we started talking about other books that I thought had great covers, because they had it was a great idea. It wasn't just fancy type or whatever. And so and this is the interesting thing about this book cover, he hired, he has a designer at HarperCollins named David G. And David designed this amazing cover, which is so great because, I don't know if people have seen it, but it says, my best mistake. But if you look at it, it originally said my biggest mistake, but they erased the letters and only left BEST. Such a smart, and then the eraser is such a great part of the design of the book, because in every chapter that eraser shows up. And I even have some of these made, which is so great. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great erasers. So David designed this amazing cover, which I loved instantly. And I'm hard to please on a cover, I have to say. But as soon as I saw this, I loved it. And here's the thing. David and I worked together many times because David is an ad copywriter who actually designs book covers on the side. So David and I have a long history of working together, and he's the guy that created that great cover.
Oh, that's a great story. I know I came to get excited when I would see the eraser separating the story, because I knew something good was coming then. So
and in the audiobook too, we have interesting sound effects for those moments too.
Oh,
for that erasing moment. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And so maybe you can share with some people, because I know we have some aspiring writers in the audience. Are writers normally involved with the selection of a cover for a book? Do you know? Is that something? Because it sounds like you did have a lot of input into your covers.
I did. My first book, I didn't have that much input, and I would say at that time, I'm sure things have changed, that I think authors were kept at arm's length away from the book cover process. But I really pushed my way in. I mean, my motto, Michelle, is dare and the world will yield. So I just elbowed my way into the process and said, I'm an ad guy. I'm all about ideas. I know how to get attention. I want to be part of the process of designing the book cover. So I've always made it a point to just muscle my way in there. And Brad Wilson at HarperCollins was really open to that, by the way. Like I said, he called me up and said, what are you thinking? As opposed to, here's your cover.
Right.
Right. So my advice is, even to a young writer who feels, and when you're doing your first book, you think you don't have a lot of sway, or you don't have you can't interrupt the process, or you can't, disagree. You really feel like you're just fortunate enough to have a book publisher and getting a book done. But I would say, dare and the world will always yield. I mean, fortune favors the bold. So just, get involved. Don't be afraid to stick your hand up and say, I disagree, or I have an idea. So that I've always done that my whole career. I mean, in the advertising world, you have to be bold. You have to stand up in a boardroom in front of, 20 people in a Labatt's board, the shiniest boardroom table you've ever seen in your life. And you have to stand up there and you have to be confident about the ideas you're presenting. So, I mean, I kind of had to learn that quick in advertising, but I think be bold.
Excellent advice. So be bold and build those relationships too.
Yeah.
Sounds like. So I will go to a question that we have. So thanks, Mr. O'Reilly, for your insights into the world of marketing. As a young audio professional who's starting their own company, what do you think is the most effective form of marketing their business? Although most podcasts do not generate income, is podcasting the best medium for marketing today?
Well, I have a podcast company called the Apostrophe Podcast Network. So we are in the podcasting business. We have 5 podcasts, by the way. Under the Influence is just one of them. Is it the best way? I don't know if it's the best way, but it is a wonderful new medium to really grab hold of. I love it because it was my whole skill set. It was about sound and writing and audio. So it was right up my alley. You can make money from podcasts. There's no doubt about that. You just have to have a big audience. I mean, it's the rule of thumb basically is, in order to attract a large advertiser, you need to have roughly between 5,000 and 10,000 downloads per week. And that's not easy to attain, by the way. It's a tough, podcast world out there, but you can make good money if you can establish a big audience. And the way you establish a big audience is through marketing and having great content.
That transitions nicely actually into our next question. So this question is a huge fan and finds you very inspiring, but they're curious about your thoughts on marketing in storytelling in today's landscape. You mentioned a bit how podcasting and social media had changed things. So can you maybe elaborate a little on that, on the change in the landscape?
Well, the big change was social media, because if you think prior to Twitter and Instagram emerging, marketing was a one-way conversation. It was a television commercial, it was a radio commercial, it was a print ad, it was a billboard, but it was a one-way communication. So social media has made it a two-way dialogue, because suddenly you can converse with the company. You can convert. A 12-year-old girl can get a message to the CEO of Pepsi on Twitter. Like it is an astounding different landscape. I love social media. There's downsides to it, but I think the key to it, to the social media, in my humble opinion, is that you have to create a relationship with, if you're a company, for example, with your customers. If you look at our Twitter account for Under the Influence, or our Instagram account, or our Facebook account, look at the conversation we're having with our listeners. It is daily. They're commenting on shows that we've done, asking us questions about marketing, suggesting fantastic episode ideas to us. It's a constant conversation. It's not a one-way deal. And the great thing about having a relationship on social media is when it does come time to sell something, so when I do have something to sell, like a book, I can do that because our listeners will accept that, because most of the time we're having a conversation. If I only sold, if I was constantly promoting and it was all I was doing, then they would ignore me, and I would have no traction that way. But because we have an established relationship, they will happily allow some marketing to happen inside a bigger conversation.
So have you pulled some ideas from those conversations with your listeners?
Oh, are you kidding? I mean, I wouldn't say 50%, but I would say 40% of the shows in any given season are suggestions from listeners. Easy. And maybe some seasons more than that.
Oh, wow. So
we listen.
That's fantastic. So one, and I think on the subject of the mediums and kind of how they change things, one of our listeners is wondering why your voice may be coming across differently in the Zoom environment. And I think maybe that I do know Zoom has different compression ratios, so it could be an answer to that question. I believe that could be one of the.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I'm not in a recording studio. I'm not speaking into a $10,000 microphone. It's and then an engineer mixes a show too, so there's compression and equalization put on voices. So two things. So a studio recording of a voice is very different from me sitting in my office with I have hard surface walls here, so there's probably a roomy effect on my voice, etc. So it doesn't have the pristine quality of a studio. And I think the other thing is too that I have a narration gear. I'm having a conversation, I'm chatting with you now, but my narration gear is different. It's not something that I purposely affect. It's just a gear I slip into when I'm reading the script for the show. It's just all I can say is it's a different gear that I have.
And so along the lines of this conversation, there is someone who is wondering about some of the books that maybe, other than your own books, that you could recommend to someone about marketing. I know you shared with us earlier that you have a few marketing books. So are there some that you could recommend?
Yeah, all those books you see behind me are just marketing books, by the way. I have a huge marketing library. I said to Ian earlier, I'm a story hunter. I'm always hunting for stories. So I'm reading constantly. I'm always making notes on marketing books. I have this constant notation going where I collect all my notes in one big file. And Command F is my friend. Like if I wanted to find a story about popsicles, I go, Command find popsicles, and all my popsicle stories will pop up. So I'm always reading. The books behind me, they are old and new. I collect books from as far back as the 1920s that were written by advertising people and books written now. Some of the better books in marketing, let me think for a second now. There's one called Squeeze This, Mr. Whipple, or Whipple Squeeze This. I can't remember which it is, by Luke Sullivan. That's one of the great advertising books. That really is just a great grounding in how to create great advertising. So I think it's called Mr. Whipple Squeeze This, which is playing off the toilet paper commercials I used to run for years, by Luke Sullivan. Great book. David Ogilvy's book called Ogilvy on Advertising, which came out in the 80s, so easily found still, is still one of the great books about advertising. It inspired me when I was first starting out. I just loved it. There is another book, eBay and things, and going through bookstores, you can find really old books. There's another one I've loved by James Webb Young. It's an old book called Diary of an Ad Man. And it is a fantastic book because his thinking, even though it's I think it was written just after the war in the 40s, his thinking is so relevant and so meaningful that it's a small book and I reread that almost once a year. It just reignites all the great philosophy about marketing that I just love. I just can't get enough of that book and his thinking. So those are some top of mind, really, really great books. And there's one more book I want to say that I see behind me here. It's called, let me just get it. Hold on for a second.
Yes, please do. We're trying to peek at your bookshelf anyways.
Okay. I love this book. This is called Ad Women.
Okay.
And it's written by Julianne Savolka. It is such a great book. There's not enough books written about the women of advertising. Look at you can tell I refer to this book a lot.
Yeah.
The great women of advertising. There's been so many great female ad people in history that created some of the greatest campaigns. They don't get enough attention, but that book really captured some of the historic great ones of all time. And if there's any young women out there that are considering a job, a career in advertising, get this book because you will be so inspired.
Oh, those are fantastic suggestions. Thank you. And thank you for sharing with us something on your bookshelf.
My pleasure.
So I'm curious about how you mentioned a bit earlier that you would do a Control F function and go through your stories.
Right.
So is that you keep your stories digital? How did you assemble all these stories for this book?
Like I say, I make notes on every single book I read, marketing or otherwise. I make notes on every single book I read. I have probably over 1,500 pages of notes now that I've collected. Even Michelle, a talk like this normally in pre-pandemic, I would be in Burlington. And so I give a lot of talks across the country in pre-pandemic times. Even when somebody would come up to me after my talk and tell me a great story, I would remember that story, go up to my hotel room, type it out on an email to myself, and then email it to myself. And then I would take that story and put it into my major notes of stories. And I may not use that story, Michelle, for 5 years. But when I do use that story, it is the best story for that moment. So I'm always, always collecting stories.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. So there must be, to be observing and on like that all the time, it might get a little tiring though. You must have thousands and thousands of stories.
It is not tiring at all. Even when, it's a funny thing, we'll go on vacation and I'll bring some books to read. And, they'll often be marketing books. And my wife, Debbie, will say, don't you want to take a break from marketing? And I'll say to her, you know what? This is candy to me. Like reading a great marketing book is like reading your favorite, I can't think of a better thing to read for me that I just love cover to cover. It's just, I don't have to take a break from it because I just love it.
Oh, wow. So we're getting to 10 minutes to the hour, but we do have one last question from the Q&A that we'll take. And they're curious, do you use an app or is there a file management system or something that you use as software to store all those stories?
Well, I just use Notes on my Mac, the Note app. And then, of course, I transfer it all to our external hard drive too, so I never have a meltdown and lose all those, years of thousands of notes. So yeah, so it's on a external hard drive, and I just quickly use the note function either on my phone or my computer, wherever I happen to be, to quickly jot down that story.
What advice? Well, thank you. Ian, do you have any words you want to have? Final words do you want to share? I do have one more question for Terry, but.
Well, I guess it's just a kind of general question about my best mistake and your career, Terry. What do you think you'd like us to take away as we listen and we read? You'd like our own lives to be informed and go in a more positive direction, or?
Yeah, I wanted this book to be inspiring.
It is, yeah.
And I'm hoping that whoever reads that book will feel at the end of the day, a mistake is not the end of the road, or that if you feel you've lost everything, if you feel you have taken the wrong fork in the road, that it might be destiny giving you or redirecting you to what you really want. They may not feel that at the time, but that destiny's got a plan for you, and it may mean detouring a little bit. And even when in my life, when I think of what I thought were detours in my career climb, or whatever you want to call it, when I look back on them, they were always slingshots. That even when I thought even my first job at FM 108, which is, here's the great example of this. I got out of Ryerson. I wanted to be an ad writer in an advertising agency. There was a recession going on in 1981. I got rejected by 60 advertising agencies. And the only place that would take me as a writer was FM 108 radio in Burlington. I did not want to be in radio. I wanted to be in an advertising agency that did radio, television, print, bill. I didn't want to specialize in radio. I had no interest in it, but it was a job. They were offering me a job. I took it. And don't I fall in love with radio? It changed the whole trajectory of my life. So that, what I thought was a detour, ended up being destiny, ended up being the universe saying, this is what you need to know, that radio is a great medium, because the universe had big plans for me in radios, and look how big a part of my life radio is today.
And how important your work is to the world. Thank you so much, Terry.
Well, thanks for that.
And we're so glad that did. So maybe as a final comment, you can, and you kind of touched on it a little with Ian, but the common thread, the common takeaway that all of these stories have, can you share with us what that underlying theme is?
When you look at the 24 chapters in that book, they look very diverse. There, as I said earlier, there's actors and directors and writers and inventors and athletes and regular people who all made huge mistakes. And you would think at first glance that they don't have a lot in common, other than the fact they made a huge, horrific mistake. But when I look at it all as a totality, here's what they have in common. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. They all worked their way through the pain of the mistake. They didn't run away. They didn't hide. Many people, when they make catastrophic mistakes, they run and they disappear, and then they stop pursuing their goal. These people didn't. They wrote it out. And you were mentioning Atul Gawande's checklist. When pilots are midair and they start having a mechanical problem and they refer to the checklist, the very first thing in the checklist is fly the plane. Because, and why that sounds so absurd, is that when pilots are trying to figure out a mechanical error and they go over here, they forget to keep flying the plane. So the first thing on the checklist is fly the plane. And I think that's what all of these people had in common. They kept flying the plane. And what they did was, and I discovered this in my own career too, is they embraced the obstacle. And what I mean by that is they peeled the problem like a banana, because sitting at the heart of the problem was the solution, was the opportunity. And if you think back to Steven Spielberg, he filleted the problem, right? he had a fish that wasn't working. And at the heart of that problem was the solution, was let's not show it. And that was the key to me. That was the thread, story to story, was they all worked their way through this gigantic, horrible mistake. Sometimes it was a small mistake. I chased two kinds of stories, catastrophic ones, and then ones that seemed so tiny and insignificant that people didn't even realize they almost made a mistake, like the popsicle guy who left his drink out on the porch. But all of them looked at the problem, ran with the problem, embraced the problem, owned it, and then on the other side, as I say, they found a better life on the other shore, because on the other side of that mistake was this incredible gift, hidden gift, that then changed their whole lives.
Wow, that's wonderful. So always look for those silver linings, right? And stick to
Silver
them.
silver linings, yeah.
So we do have someone who is wondering how they might contact you, maybe through your website or something.
Yeah, very simply, you can always, there's lots of ways to find me. If you just look up, my website is terryoreilly.ca, and there's ways to connect with me on there. hello@terryoreilly.ca gets to me. So there's lots of ways to contact.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for partnering with us this afternoon, and thank you for engaging Terry in this fantastic conversation.
Always an honor to work with you, Michelle, and thank you so much, Terry. It's been
Thank you, Ian. Great to see you again.
See you, sir.
And thank you, Terry, for being so generous with your time and your conversation. This was a lovely chat this afternoon, and I highly recommend everyone look for the book. Of course, it's available to borrow in our collection, and our good friend Ian Elliott has it on his shelves as well at the Different Drummer Bookstore. And thank you, everyone, for choosing to spend time with us this afternoon, and have a great afternoon, and take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.